Welcome to Cambridge Forum, discussing homosexuality and civilization. I'm Pat Zerke. For 37 years, Cambridge Forum has been bringing you live public discussions of the issues and ideas that are shaping our world. From the recent U.S. Supreme Court decision striking down sodomy laws, to the campaign for a constitutional amendment prohibiting gay marriage, gay rights and related issues are at the forefront of the news. Why are the debates about gay rights so tumultuous? What role has homosexuality had in our culture and the civilizations from which it grew? What lessons can contemporary activists for gay and lesbian rights draw from the past? With us to explore the rich and terrible history of homosexuality and civilization is Louis Crompton, Professor Emeritus of English at the University of Nebraska and a pioneer in the field of gay and lesbian studies. Professor Crompton is the co-founder of the Gay and Lesbian Caucus of the Modern Language Association and the author of numerous books, including the acclaimed Byron and Greek Love, Homophobia in 19th Century England. His current book, from Harvard University Press, Homosexuality and Civilization, serves as the basis of our discussion. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, Louis Crompton.
Well, thank you, Pat. It's an honor to speak at the forum and at the home of Harvard University and the press, which has so generously fashioned my book. I'm also impressed that so many people have ventured out on an evening which has not been too pleasant. Homosexuality and civilization, as a glance at the contents will indicate, begins with the ancient Greeks and touches on a dozen cultures up to the time of the French Revolution, that is, about 1800. I may say something later about why I chose to stop there. Today, homosexuality, of course, holds the spotlight as one of the hottest topics of the hour here in Massachusetts and in the nation at large. Unfortunately, since gay marriage is a relatively novel issue in world history, my book touches on the topic only incidentally. I hope, however, that what I've written will have some relevance to the current debate in throwing light on the history of attitudes towards homosexuality in Western civilization and showing how strikingly these contrast with that of other societies. I first got the idea for this book as long ago as 1970, when a course I introduced at the University of Nebraska was challenged by a state senator who actually proposed a bill making any discussion of homosexuality at state colleges illegal. The bill, fortunately, failed. My first plan was to trace the history of anti-homosexual laws in the Middle Ages, Renaissance, and Enlightenment, and to document the persecutions that took place under their influence. Since this would have produced mainly a very grim roster of burnings, hangings, drownings, beheadings, and mutilations, I chose, for the sake of contrast, to begin with two early civilizations where such horrors were not known, classical Greece and Rome, and then added chapters on pre-modern China and Japan. The chapter on China was somewhat providential. It was very difficult at that time to find out anything about homosexuality in China, but a friend who was teaching in Hong Kong happened to send me a book which looked like a rather impressive scholarly treatment of the subject. The only difficulty was it was in Chinese. Fortunately, the English department happened to have a student, a graduate student from mainland China on hand, and he was quite interested in translating the book for me. So the first chapter I found myself sketching out was one I doubted I would be able to write at all. but to begin at the beginning. The preeminent place of ancient Greek culture in Western history hardly needs emphasis. We all recognize that the modern world owes an immeasurable debt to the Greeks in art, literature, science, and philosophy. Yet in Anglo-Saxon academic scholarship, any reference to one element of Greek culture was for long taboo. In E.M. Forster's novel Morris, written in 1910, the Cambridge translation class is routinely cautioned, omit a reference to the unspeakable vice of the Greeks. Even 4 decades later, a scholar of repute could still remark, quote, "This aspect of Greek morals is an extraordinary one, into which, for the sake of our own equanimity, it is unprofitable to pry too closely." Indeed, for hundreds of years in Western society, homosexuality had been referred to by a Latin formula, peccatum non nominandum inter Christianos, the sin not even to be mentioned among Christians. Yet when we turn to the actual texts of Greek history and literature, accounts of homosexual love turn out to be so abundant that the investigator is overwhelmed. Greek lyric poets sing of same-sex love from almost the earliest fragments down to the end of classical times. 5 brilliant philosophical dialogues debate its ethics with a wealth of illustrations, from Plato and Xenophon in the 4th century BC to Plutarch and the Pseudo-Lucian in the 3rd century after Christ. In the public theater, we know that tragedies on this theme by such writers as Aeschylus and Sophocles were popular, and Aristophanes' body humor is quite as likely to be inspired by sex between males as between men and women. Though it has often been assumed that the love of males was a fashion confined to a small intellectual elite during the age of Plato, it can in fact be shown that it was pervasive through all levels of Greek society and held an honored place in Greek culture for more than 1,000 years, that is, from before 600 BC to 400 AD. Throughout these accounts, male attachments are generally speaking presented in an honorific light, though there are always some skeptics. But for many Greek biographers, for a man not to have a lover seems to have bespoken a lack of character or a deficiency of sensibility. It is this enthusiastic note, marked by a kind of spirited elan, that so uniquely distinguishes the Greek view of homosexuality. It is sounded clearly and strongly in what is probably the most notable defense of male love in Greek literature, the speech which Plato puts in the mouth of Phaedrus at the beginning of the Symposium. Here is how the idealistic Athenian praises the male eros. "For I know not any greater blessing to a young man who is beginning life than a virtuous lover, or to a lover than a beloved youth. For the principle that ought to be the guide of men who live nobly, that principle, I say, neither family, nor honor, nor wealth, nor any other motive is able to implant as well as love." Of what am I speaking? Of the sense of honor and dishonor, without which neither states nor individuals ever do any good or great work. And if there were only some way of contriving that a state or an army should be made up of lovers and their loves, they would be the very best governors of their own city. And it is scarcely an exaggeration to say that when fighting at each other's side, although a mere handful, they would overcome the world. Well, this sounds like a really fantastic fantasy, and yet we know that within a decade, in the city of Thebes, the famous sacred band of 300 pairs of lovers was constituted and fought as the most effective military organization in Greece for more than a generation. It is an irony of history that the two cultures which have done most to shape Western civilization should have adopted antithetical views on homosexuality at almost the same time. In the 6th century before Christ, Greece produced the homoerotic poetry of Solon, Sappho, and Anacreon, and at its close, Athens witnessed in 514 the martyrdom of the tyrannicides, Aristogeiton and Harmodius, who became civic emblems of heroic male love. In the same century, a few hundred miles away in ancient Palestine, a law was incorporated into the Hebrew Scriptures, which was ultimately to have far greater influence and indeed to affect the fate of homosexuals in half the world down to our own day. We do not know precisely when the authors of the book of Leviticus promulgated this legislation. As with the dating of most books in the Old Testament, controversy abounds. But the date most widely accepted by modern scholarship for the so-called Holiness Code in Leviticus is about 550 BC. As one of the 5 books of the law or Torah, Leviticus is a compendium of legislation purportedly decreed by Moses. But Moses is assumed to have lived about 1300 BC, and it is now generally agreed among biblical scholars that the 5 books of the Pentateuch, traditionally ascribed by Jewish tradition and the medieval church to Moses, took on their present form at a much later date. We may assume that though some of the enactments may be ancient and even Mosaic, many originated in later times in response to later conditions. The opening chapters of Leviticus prescribe rites for burnt offerings, for priestly consecrations, for the treatment of leprosy, and give dietary rules for distinguishing clean from unclean animals. Among Christians and among Jews not strictly Orthodox, these statutes are regarded as archaic and non-binding in today's world. Chapter 18, however, condemns certain sexual acts, including incest and male homosexuality. Chapter 20 adds to the general condemnation of Chapter 18 a specific penalty for sexual relations between males. In framing this enactment, the authors of Leviticus wrote 24 words which sealed the fate of men who loved men in the Western world for more than 14 centuries. As rendered by the translators of the King James Version, they were, "If a man lie with mankind as he lieth with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood shall be upon them." It's rather interesting that if you look back in Massachusetts history to the body of laws and liberties that was passed here in 1641, the Massachusetts law on sodomy did not repeat the English sodomy statute of Henry VIII. Instead, they used this Old Testament language verbatim, word for word, in the law code. And the same thing happened in Connecticut. In fact, the Connecticut law remained on the books until 1822. New Haven went a step further and introduced the first and only law in any Anglo-Saxon jurisdiction that made lesbianism a capital crime. Fortunately, New Haven was absorbed in the state of Connecticut shortly afterwards, so that law was only on the books for 3 or 4 years. Unlike the legislation on ritual, this law was also taken to apply to non-Jews living under Jewish jurisdiction. It is therefore a mistake to argue, as some apologists have done, that this law was akin to enactments on ritual and not binding on Gentiles. Leviticus 18:26 specifically extends the prohibition to, quote, any stranger that sojourneth among you. Such a law was one of the so-called Noachic precepts, that is, laws binding on all the descendants of Noah, literally all mankind. There is much that is humane in the ethic of the Old Testament. Its prophets and lawgivers show a sensitive concern for the oppressed and the weak. Perhaps the story of their enslavement in Egypt and their struggles with formidable empires that so often ended their independence bred in the Jews a special compassion. The Hebrew Scriptures reveal sympathy for the stranger or alien, for the poor, for the deaf and blind, for orphans and widows, even for hungry animals whom the law protects. The same Levitical code that ordered the extermination of male homosexuals commanded men and women to love their neighbor as themselves. But for the priestly authors of Leviticus, a man who engaged in same-sex relations was not a neighbor. He was a deadly danger to be extirpated. If Judaism had remained merely the religion of a small tribe in the eastern Mediterranean, such fierce bigotry, though deplorable, would have had relatively small effect. A man would only have had to walk for a few days to escape its jurisdiction. But Judaism became the parent of a powerful world religion, Christianity, and when the Roman Empire became Christian in the 4th century, the Old Testament death penalty for male homosexual behavior was in effect incorporated into Roman law. Later, this same precedent was cited when death for homosexual behavior was prescribed in the law codes of European countries such as France, England, Germany, Italy, and Switzerland. So we have then a history of prejudice which extends down the centuries and is still, to a degree, with us in the 20th century. Fortunately, the death penalty ends in Europe in the early 19th century. But when we look at 20th century history, we may certainly wonder to what extent the just as traditional anti-Semitism certainly helped pave the way for the Nazi attitudes toward treatment of the Jews, so these ancient homophobic prescriptions paved the way for the sending of many thousand homosexuals to Nazi death camps.
This is a good time for me to say you're joining us at Cambridge Forum, listening to Louis Crompton discussing homosexuality and civilization. Professor Crompton, I wonder if you could tell us some more about what you found in the Chinese text and how does the non-Western civilizations' view of homosexuality contrast with the Greek and the Hebrew views that you've discussed?
Well, fortunately, the Chinese from the earliest times have shown a passion for detailed and meticulous historical records. So we have a longer tradition of documentable tolerance in China than we have in any other culture. Japanese history begins much later than Chinese history because the Japanese did not have a written language till much later. And of course, the Greeks, though they took a positive view with the coming of Christianity, then dropped that, and it became anathema to the Greek Orthodox Church. In China, early biographers felt free to treat sexuality including love affairs between men with remarkable openness. And this freedom was extended also to poets, playwrights, and writers of fiction in the classical Chinese modes. Less fortunately, this candor disappeared with the establishment of the People's Republic in 1949, and tolerance for love between men that existed in the Middle Kingdom, the part such affairs played in the lives of famous Chinese in history, and the literature on this theme that flourished for more than 2 millennia have all been lost sight of. Chinese history before the 8th century BC, though copious, is largely legendary. Only in the period of the so-called Spring and Autumn Annals, which begin about 700 BC, and in the subsequent age of the Warring States, do we touch solid ground with trustworthy sources. With the Han Dynasty, that is about 200 BC, these become full and precise. To each of these eras belongs a famous anecdote concerning the male lover of a ruler. Eventually, these stories became so well known as touchstones for male romance in a courtly setting that they may be called the 3 canonical anecdotes. They were respectively the stories of the shared peach, of Lung Yan and the fish, and of the cut sleeve. The first anecdote concerns the infatuation of the ruler of the northern state of Wei, who was a contemporary of Confucius and the Athenian tyrannicides. He loved a court official named Mi Xia, who one day gave him half of a delicious peach to eat. "How sincere is your love for me," Duke Lin exclaimed. "You forget your own appetite and think only of giving me good things." When Mizi Xia borrowed the ruler's carriage to visit his sick mother, the Duke praised him for his filial piety, although such temerity would ordinarily have cost the subject his feet. The second anecdote tells of another ruler of Wei, this time a king of a century later, whose lover, the Lord Lung Yang, burst into tears when the 2 men were fishing. The king asked the reason for his distress. Lung Yang replied that he had been impressed by the first fish he caught, but when he caught a bigger one, he wanted to throw it back. So, he feared, might the king prefer someone else to him. To reassure him, the king issued an edict: "Whoever shall dare to speak of beauties in my presence will have his whole clan extirpated." The third and most famous story involved not a duke or a king, but an emperor, the young Emperor Ai of the Han Dynasty, who ruled about the time of Christ. According to a famous Han historian, the emperor once sought to rise when his lover had fallen asleep on the sleeve of his robe. Rather than disturb him, he cut off his sleeve and appeared in public in this mutilated state. Thereafter, reputedly, his courtiers adopted similar abbreviations to celebrate the love affair. These 3 stories are repeatedly invoked in Chinese literary and historical works. Indeed, they became proverbial, so that for 2,000 years, homosexual love was regularly referred to the love of the shared peach or the cut sleeve. An important anthology of stories and anecdotes published in late imperial times was entitled simply Records of the Cut Sleeve. Clearly, these normative tales, if we may so call them, show an unself-conscious acceptance of same-sex relations. They contrast strikingly with the myth that dominated the imagination of Western Christendom, the story of Sodom with its supernatural terrors. But these were also quite distinct from the traditions of ancient Greece. Instead of legends of heroic self-sacrifice in a warrior society, we have piquant tales of delicate consideration and tenderness. Love for the Chinese was rarely the inspiration it was for the Greeks. the Arabs, and the troubadours. Rather than ennobling experiences, male love affairs in ancient China were elegant diversions suffused with poetic sentiment. This was in keeping with Chinese cultural norms. Unlike the classical and feudal West and medieval Japan, China exalted not the warrior, but the scholar, the man of letters, refinement, and taste. It is of some interest that these stories do not come down to us in books on love or in prose or verse romances, but in collections of political writings full of hard-headed advice about the governing of states. The Chinese were acutely aware that romance plays a fleeting role in human affairs. Han Fei-zi, who wrote about 240 BC, recorded the shared peach episode in an acerbic treatise that has been compared to Machiavelli's The Prince. The moral of the story is not the power of love, but the fickleness of the mighty, and the advisability of rulers' acts being determined by laws and not by personal attachments. When Mi Zi Xia grew older and lost his beauty, the Duke of Wei, Han Fei-zi tells us, turned against him. The Duke must have been a bit of a humorist, for he excused himself with the cynical remark, "After all, he once stole my carriage, and another time he gave me a half-eaten peach to eat." The traditional commentary on the story of Lung Yang unromantically doubts the efficacy of the king's edict banning rival beauties, as the love of the Emperor Ai for his young lover, Dong Xian, the latter's end was more tragic still. Although the emperor was faithful to his lover to the end, the court was scandalized by his proposal to alienate the succession in his favor. When the sickly Ai died at an early age, his lover was forced to commit suicide. Well, these things had nothing to do with homosexuality. Wives, concubines, and ministers were subject to the same mischances. Happy endings in romances were more common at a humbler level of society. The most famous of the early Chinese writers of history is the writer referred to regularly as the Grand Historian. And his name was Sima Qian. In his celebrated history, he mixes annals and biographies, including the lives of emperors, statesmen, and noble families, Confucian scholars, generals, and wandering knights. It is significant that among these luminaries he allots space also to the biographies of the emperor's male favorites, that is, to their lovers, whose stories he introduces with a revealing summary. Those who served the ruler and succeeded in delighting his ears and eyes, those who caught their lord's fancy and won his favor and intimacy, did so not only through the power of lust and love, each had certain abilities in which he excelled. Thus I made the biography of the emperor's male favorites. Well, after this preamble, we might expect a panegyric on male love, like we find in Plato, but the accounts are free both from romance and cynicism. They are a cool reckoning of individuals and their influence on imperial affairs. The grand historian does not, like Suetonius, writing on the Roman emperors, treat these affairs as damaging gossip that reflects negatively on his subjects, nor does he, in the style of Plutarch, treat them as honorific. They are simply natural phenomena. It is not women alone, he writes, who can use their looks to attract the eyes of the ruler. Courtiers and eunuchs can play at that game as well. Many were the men of ancient times who gained favor in this way. There is no intimation that such affairs are either good or bad. The men are to be judged simply on their merits. Well, that gives you a little bit of the flavor of the Chinese approach, particularly in the early period.
Thank you. How the situation in Western civilization is clearly very different. How do you account for the history of persecution of homosexual behavior in the Judeo-Christian tradition?
Well, the Judeo-Christian tradition really does stand apart, because if you compare it, for instance, with other religions, such as Buddhism or moral philosophies like Confucianism, or if you look at the Hindu laws, you do not find this ferocity. In fact, if there is legislation, it's of a very temperate sort. Homosexuality may be put on the same level as illicit heterosexual relations, fornication, for instance. So that this is a rare phenomenon. Now, the three Abrahamic religions, which trace themselves back to the Old Testament, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, then have this tradition, and that really does set them apart. Now, how the tradition got established in the Old Testament, why that law is there, when it's such an anomaly in the terms of world history, remains a question that is probably just about unanswerable. People have speculated that the Jews were concerned about population. Well, that would make sense. Here was a small group of people in the path of warring empires who conquered them repeatedly, and one can see why they would be concerned to encourage marriage and anything that led to a population increase. However, the death penalty seems to me a little severe as a measure there. The Roman aristocracy had the same problem, and when Augustus addressed it, what he did was to take away some of their civil privileges, including their attendance at the games. So that was on a totally different level. It seems to me hard to account for the law in those terms. I make a speculative guess, which has actually been proposed before, that this had to do with the conflict between Judaism and competing religions in the area of Palestine. That Canaanite religions are accused of fostering or permitting incest and homosexuality. This is in Leviticus. And there are a number of references in the King James Version of the Old Testament to sodomites. This translation of the Hebrew has been very controversial. And in fact, if we look at one of the Hebrew laws there, it's rather startling what is going on linguistically. The law says, if you translate it into literal English, there shall be no holy woman among the daughters of Israel, or any holy man among the sons of Israel. That seems like an odd law. And the Jewish terms, holy woman is kadishah and holy man is kaddish. Well, then if you look at the King James translation of that, what you get is, there shall be no whore among the daughters of Israel, and no sodomite among the sons of Israel. These seem very odd translations for holy woman and holy man. So what is going on? Well, we know that in many Near Eastern religions in early days, there was such a thing as sacred female prostitution. There were various cults. The cult of Aphrodite in Corinth, for instance, the temple is supposed to have had 1,000 sacred prostitutes in attendance. And we have accounts in Babylon and many other cultures. In India in the 20th century, there were still tens of thousands of temple prostitutes. Male temple prostitution, however, is very, very hard to document. So I feel a little bit dubious about the translation in the revised Standard English version, which substitutes for sodomite, there shall be no female cultic prostitute or any male cultic prostitute among the sons of Israel. The likelier situation, I think, is that these holy men were not exactly equivalent of female temple prostitutes, but more like what you might call transvestite shamans. And we do have very full documentation for traditions of this sort throughout Near Eastern religions in Old Testament times. The most famous of these, of course, was the cult of the Great Mother, the goddess Sibylle in Phrygia, whose devotees wore women's clothes, wore women's makeup and hairstyle, and then castrated themselves in honor of the goddess. And these men were revered and despised at the same time. They had sacred powers which were very potent and that people were in fear of. They were regarded as prophets and healers at the same time as they're giving up their masculinity, degraded them in the eyes of other men. So it's stated in the Old Testament that in the reign of Solomon's son, this particular king engaged in all kinds of idolatrous practices, and then it adds, and there were holy men in the land, in the King James Version, and there were sodomites in the land. Then his grandson, this king's grandson, who is a pious adherent of Judaism, is praised for getting rid of the holy men that his grandfather had countenanced. And then his son gets rid of the remnant of the sodomites that were in the land. But 200 or 300 years later, in the reign of King Josiah, when there's this very dramatic religious reform with the slaughter of rival priesthoods and the desecration of their altars, the statement is made that the king broke down the houses of the sodomites that were in the temple. So this cult, whatever it was, survived through these hundreds of years and was perceived as a threat by the people who were defining Orthodox Judaism. So this is at least one possibility for the intensity of this animus. And of course, if you look at Deuteronomy, the big danger, the terrible thing that can happen is apostasy from Judaism. And this is something that is to be met with death. If your brother or your wife or your best friend is thought to go after strange gods, then you are to be the first to stone him or her. So it may be out of this ethos that the law grew.
And out of this Jewish ethos came the various Western European Christian traditions and laws.
Oh, how did it get into the Christian tradition? Because so many Jewish laws were dropped. The dietary laws, for instance, are in effect abrogated in the New Testament. But unlike John Boswell, who sees these laws as specifically Jewish and not influencing early Christianity, which he thinks Christianity doesn't become really strongly homophobic till about the 13th century. But in fact, if you look at the most influential of the Western fathers of the church, Tertullian, he endorses the Mosaic death penalty, refers to Leviticus. So does the church historian Eusebius, and so does a very influential document, the Apostolic Constitutions, which were supposed to date back to St. Peter. They all refer to Leviticus and support the idea of the death penalty. If you read the sermons of St. John Chrysostom, who was by far the most influential father of the Greek church, they are extremely virulent. He gets the prize for anti-Semitism among the fathers of the church. He writes in a style that Catholics would not dream of writing in today. And he is also the one who preaches most violently on homosexuality. Ordinarily, sermons were not devoted to this subject, but St. John Chrysostom preaches that men of this sort should be taken out and stoned forthwith. So the tradition is simply taken over from Judaism. Of course, St. Paul is important as a link there too, because of his condemnation of not only male but also female homosexuality in the first chapter of Romans.
Okay. You're listening to Louis Crompton discussing homosexuality and civilization. The floor is now open for audience questions if you would use the microphone in the center aisle. And while you're gathering your thoughts, let me ask you to say a little bit more particularly about lesbian same-sex love, because you've talked a lot about male homosexuality, but you haven't said a lot about the laws and the traditions that affected lesbian.
Well, thank you, because that's what I certainly want to address. It's interesting that there's no reference to lesbianism in the Old Testament at all, unless perhaps you take the story of Ruth and Naomi. But there's certainly no prohibition parallel to the male prohibition. And the topic does appear in the Talmud very briefly. There's a debate about whether or not a lesbian, someone who's had an affair with another woman, should be allowed to marry a priest. A priest's wife was supposed to be a virgin. Well, some of the rabbis take the view that this kind of marriage would be forbidden, but the consensus is to follow another rabbi who says that this is not a serious impediment. When we get to St. Paul, however, it's quite different. He puts the two, male and female homosexuality, on the same level and talks about God giving idolaters over to vile affections, both women and men. So they're put on the same basis, and eventually, considerably later, laws against lesbianism are incorporated into Christian laws in states dating from about the 13th century.
I've got one question, which is, I'm wondering how you managed to settle on a definition for homosexuality that applies to all people, men and women, throughout all cultures for 2,600 years. And could you share with us a definition?
Well, obviously, I'm using the broadest possible definition, a kind of lowest common denominator. People who have relations with members of the same sex. Now, of course, this raises a question of identities, because there are people who engage in such relations without, in our current society, necessarily identifying themselves as homosexuals. But when we look back, though, in each of these societies, people had very different conceptions connected with same-sex relations. They would have brought to mind a totally different set of circumstances in Chinese culture, Japanese culture, ancient Rome, for instance. So I don't want to de-emphasize the differences, which were enormous. Nevertheless, you can, in ancient Greece, find among those dialogues I mentioned, at least two of them which are dialogues between gays and straights. In other words, some of the debaters define themselves as lovers of women, others as lovers of boys. They're setting these as polar opposites. And there's a fascinating dialogue in Japanese, written about 1630, in which we have the same situation, a group of men who are debating, the premise is something like whether the love of women can be as elegant as the love of boys, which sounds a little bit prejudice there. And in other cultures, even the medieval cultures, it isn't simply sodomitical acts, but there are also references to men of this sort, that kind of man. And in medieval France, he is assumed to be someone who despises women. So there's a definition there that involves more than simply the sexual relation between the two people of the same gender.
Thank you. I'm sure we all appreciate your wonderful book and your presentation today. I just wanted to ask a quick question about the destruction of evidence. And I just used two examples. I presume you have them in the book, but it seems to me that more has been destroyed than has survived. Sappho, for instance, however many books of her poems, and all the fragments have survived largely among grammarians because she used such an unusual form of the ablative. Now, I think that may be a sign of queerness, using the ablative, the way Proust uses various unusual forms of the verb. But anyway, Sappho, we have just a meager fragment. But I want to, even in our own times, done some work on Walt Whitman, and he had a multitude of letters that came from lovers, men, and those were scattered to the wind. They were gathered together, the majority of them by a wealthy businessman in Detroit, I think, and he held on to those letters and would let nobody except those he trusted read them, and none of them were ever published until on his deathbed he willed them to the people of the United States. They came to the Library of Congress, and those who were fortunate enough to be there when they arrived were astonished at, one of the letters has a nice line, "I wish you were here," from a soldier, "I wish you were here today, Walt Whitman, so you could go down on my BK in the office." I'll let you guess what BK means.
Well, this problem of the destruction of evidence, of course, is enormous. Sappho wrote 9 books of poetry, and we have 2 complete poems. And this is, as you said, just a fluke that a couple of grammarians happened to quote them. We know from reading Athenaeus, who wrote a long dialogue about many, many different subjects, including male homosexuality, that there were Greek plays on the subject of male love, and that these were applauded and appreciated. He mentions that. And he also talks about these plays by Aeschylus and Sophocles, which were popular. And Fortunately, in the Aeschylus play, we do have a couple of lines which define the relation between Achilles and Patroclus, who are the main characters. But an unimaginable amount has been lost. Then also there's the problem that minorities ordinarily pass on traditions. I mean, parents pass on traditions to the children. Relics and documents are cherished and preserved carefully. Whereas with homosexuals, when somebody, for instance, who might have made a collection of writings on the subject, say back about 1800, died, his library would probably be destroyed by embarrassed relatives, or letters that seemed, in their point of view, incriminating would be put to the torch. So this is a particularly big problem in this area.
Feel free to line up at the microphone.
I think would you say something about the word lesbian, which I believe comes from the Greek island of Lesbos, and what was the culture there? How did the term originate? Were men allowed on the island? What's the story?
Okay. Well, the word, of course, came to designate female homosexuality because of Sappho, who lived on the island of Lesbos. And in fact, in some of the Greek dialogues, well, there are a couple of dialogues by Lucian among the dialogues of the courtesans, which deal with lesbians, and one of the women there comes from the island of Lesbos. This term was not generally used for female homosexuality until the late 19th century. I did find one use of it in the late 16th century, where this French writer who wrote a book on women, in which he included a chapter on lesbianism, uses the term les lesbiennes, but that was a kind of nonce use of the word. The word in regular currency at that time in English and French was the term tribad. Yes, next question.
I have a question on James Boswell. Two questions on James Boswell. John Boswell. What do you think of his work in general? Is it valid? Is there a lot that's good there? And secondly, his take on this, what he likened to a male wedding ceremony, a ritual that he likened to two men getting married. Do you have any opinions on that?
Yes, I'm not. You were asking about John Boswell's views on same-sex marriage.
Yes, and generally his work in general. Do you think there's a lot valid in his work?
Okay. Well, I admire John Boswell immensely. He was the real pioneer in the field of gay history. He put it on the map and made it possible for others to work here. But my book generally runs counter to his assumptions because, as I say, he tends to discount the biblical and early Christian prohibitions. With respect to his book on what we might call gay marriages, he uses the term same-sex unions. And these are, in fact, if you look at the material, religious rituals in the Christian church for affirmations of spiritual brotherhood. And these may well have been rituals that some gay men may have availed themselves to in order to establish a bond and give it a kind of social status. But given the ferocious homophobia of the Greek church, it's hard to imagine that these would have been seen as condoning male homosexuality. Now, he does mention a very astonishing episode that took place in Rome and did involve something that approximated a marriage. The episode took place in 1578 in the pontificate of Gregory XIII. We know him mainly through the Gregorian calendar. There was a report of these marriages in the letters of the Venetian envoy to Rome, and the French writer Montaigne, fortunately for us, visited Rome a couple of years later, and in his travel journals of 1580 and 81, he confirms that the ceremonies were conducted in full seriousness and were an attempt, however foolhardy, to give dignity to relationships the men took seriously. Now here's Montaigne's comment in his journal. It's a bit sad that he approaches the matter rather superciliously, but this is what he says. On my return from St. Peter's, I met a man who informed me humorously of two things. The Portuguese made their obeisance to the Pope in Passion Week. That means they suffered in making it. And then on that same day, the Station of the Cross was at St. John's at the Porta Latina, in which church a few years before certain Portuguese had entered into a strange brotherhood. They married one another, male to male, at Mass, with the same ceremonies with which we perform our marriage services, the same marriage gospel service, and then went to bed and lived together. The Roman wits said that because in the other conjunction of male with female, this circumstance alone makes it legitimate, it had seemed to these sharp folk that this other action would become equally legitimate if they could authorize it with ceremonies and mysteries of the church. And then the final comment, 8 or 9 Portuguese of this fine sect were burned. So that hardly suggests a tolerant attitudes towards gay marriage on the part of the Catholic Church in the 16th centuries. And the Venetian ambassador says that they captured, in fact, 11 men who were given to the fire as they deserved. So it seems to me almost incredible that that ceremony could have taken place at that time and in these circumstances, but the documentation seems irrefutable.
I apologize if you have mentioned this earlier, but in the course of doing your research, when and where do you find the earliest account of homosexuality?
The earliest account in Greek culture, this is about 700 BC. That would be about 100 years before Sappho, in the town of Colchis on an island that's on the east coast of Greece, where a military commander says goodbye to his young lover, goes off to fight in battle and is killed and becomes a local hero. Again, in that's a little earlier than the Chinese material. Now, I did not go into the Gilgamesh epic and some of these Near Eastern traditions, which would certainly be earlier than that. I chose to start with Greece, so I don't really have I can't give you a definitive answer for the earliest documentable episode.
Would you talk a little bit about Edward Carpenter and Magnus Hirschfeld, who, to my mind, seem like the originators of modern gay liberation movements and the extraordinary social climate that must have existed to allow them to flourish, at least for the short time that they did.
Very brave pioneers, both of them, Edward Carpenter and Magnus Hirschfeld. They were members of very different cultures, however. Germany made it possible to inaugurate a gay movement in a way that was not possible in England. And the reason for this was the prestige that science and research held in German society and German universities, so that the Germans were able to invent the science of sexology, which made it possible to discuss homosexuality without using a lot of pejorative theological language. Well, they gave us the word homosexual at that time, about 1870. In England, there was this silence taboo that I talked about. So Carpenter had to be much more careful than Hirschfeld. Hirschfeld organized a society, the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, got important influential people to sign it, had an institute for the study of sex in Berlin, which was world famous and so forth, all of which, of course, ended under the Nazis who destroyed the institute. And that episode of book building you see on the filmed over and over again, actually, as I understand, the books of the Hirschfeld Institute. Now, Carpenter ran into another real tragedy in the fact that he just got underway publishing on this subject when the Oscar Wilde case happened. He just published an essay called Homogenic Love. And there was such hostility to homosexuality that surfaced in England in connection with the trial that he had to be much more cautious, and his works, you need to read between the lines often. You don't have the direct scientific approach that you do in Hirschfeld, but all the more honor to him.
If it's not too greedy, I'd like to ask 3 questions. If that means you have to keep your answers especially short, so be it. Fine with me. Okay, I was flipping through Bishop Shelby Spong's book, Rescuing the Bible from Fundamentalism, and he mentioned the possibility that St. Paul's condemnation of sex in general just might indicate that he was actually gay, especially when he said, better to marry than to burn. What do you think of that one?
Yes. Well, there have been various speculations. There's also the speculation which has turned up repeatedly in history as to whether or not Jesus and St. John, for instance, might have been lovers. And we find that in a remarkable number of sources in Christopher Marlowe, in the French writer Diderot, in Jeremy Bentham. With respect to St. Paul, I guess I'm unwilling to play the psychologist here. He is obviously having terrible difficulty with sexuality, and this is a disaster. You know, if we compare him with Jesus in this regard, Bentham made note of the fact that Jesus is silent on the subject of homosexuality, whereas Paul is vehement. So what the basis for that intense emotional aversion to sex is, I don't think I'm prepared to say, but it's one of the tragedies of world history.
Okay, and I heard once, I don't know where, it was a long time ago, that when the writers of Greek myths made their male heroes lose their wives or girlfriends early on because it wasn't considered masculine for the men to be involved with women for any long period of time. Care to comment on that?
I'm sorry, I missed the first reference. What's the context again?
That the writers of Greek myths.
Oh, Greek myths, yes.
Yes. Made their male heroes lose their girlfriends or wives early in the story, as with Hercules, for example, Heracles, excuse me, or Theseus, because it wasn't considered truly masculine for the male heroes to be involved with women for any length of time.
Well, I guess one of the problems is they lost their boyfriends too. The Greek myths tend to deal with tragic events. Hercules loses Hylas when he's with the Argonauts. Apollo's young lover Hyacinth is killed. So is Cyparissus. So that this seems to be a pattern on both sides, I would say.
Yeah, true. And finally, how would you care to comment on the late Quentin Crisp's role in the history of homosexuality?
Well, I'm not too knowledgeable about Quentin Crisp, but he certainly comes across as a fascinating and delightful character. He seems to delight in not fitting into any nice particular category. He doesn't align himself with the gay liberation movement or the reformer. He seems to be content to be unique and perhaps there's a kind of dandyism which is a little bit akin to Oscar Wilde, I suppose. There, one enjoys his performance. I guess I'd put it that way.
You've looked at a lot of cultures and a lot of civilizations in the past. Given the fact that current American society comes from one of the more persecuting civilizations, do you look on the current debates, the current openness to discussing same-sex marriage, the Supreme Court decisions as a positive sign? Do you see traits in American culture today that replicate some of the traits of the more tolerant cultures of the past?
Well, of course, American culture is undergoing a very dramatic transformation. I mean, what has happened with respect to gay marriage just in the last 12 months is almost unbelievable. Because other cultures have not had the level of homophobia, it's there's no way of really making a comparison with them. They have not had to face the same intense negatives. So we're faced with a more or less unique situation, I think. But as I comment at the end of my book, and perhaps I'll conclude by reading the last couple of paragraphs, which in a degree address this subject. Homosexuals, of course, have not been the only victims of faith-inspired intolerance. Historically, crusades against heretics, Muslims, Jews, and witches, all justified on biblical grounds, led to far more deaths than laws against homosexuality. Cruel and unjust institutions such as slavery were, in the not-too-distant past, defended by theologians, including Protestant clergy in the United States of America. But religious leaders also deplored such crimes and today decry them. It is to the credit of Christianity that it has been unable to abandon convictions strongly held for centuries, admitting past errors and seeking reconciliation. There are even some Vatican documents on this subject. So the Vatican has expressed regret for anti-Semitism and the persecution of religious dissent, and America's Southern Baptists for their endorsement of slavery in the 19th century and racial segregation in the 20th. The debt owed by civilization to Christianity is enormous. how can we not be grateful for the works of compassion, its service to education, and its contribution to the world's treasury of great art, architecture, and music? We must recognize that church leaders have throughout the ages worked for peace and the alleviation of human oppression, and give thanks for the countless priests, nuns, and Protestant clergy who have labored selflessly, sometimes at the cost of their lives, in the service of humanity. A religion that preached love and hate has left most of the hate behind. Christianity has proved itself a creed with a conscience, not lacking in men and women of goodwill. Even in the case of homosexuality, there have been Christians, though there are still a prophetic minority disconcerting to church officialdom. About the future, one may be modestly hopeful, though the controversy will doubtless be long and impassioned. But scholarship has now brought to light the long record of oppression and abuse, and men and women who call themselves Christian can no longer plead ignorance or avoid the burden of a deplorable, long obscured past.
Thank you, Louis.